You spent a lot of time together before you fell in love, is that right?
We ran a mail-order record company together for several months before we became romantically involved. And then we fought for 8 years. It was not an easy relationship. It was a very challenging, a very exciting relationship. But Charles wanted, as he said, love with an address. He wanted to move in, and I did not want, my marriage had disintegrated, and I did not want a relationship, a live-in relationship. So this caused many battles for, for a long time, and then years later we moved in together, never fought again, and Charles, we moved in together in 1972, and Charles died in 1979. So it was a fairly brief time that we actually lived together. But we were together over a period of 15 years. It's a long time.
Yeah, he was a very difficult person, I'm sure you would agree. What do you think, what made him so furious?
No, he wasn't furious. Our arguments were essentially about our relationship. Charles's reputation was as jazz's angry man, and he certainly had plenty to be angry about. He was the wrong color in a white society. He was a very sensitive artist, unappreciated for this enormous. Charles left one of the largest legacies in 20th century American composition, but at the time, he was not known as a composer. There's been a major change in perception of who Charles Mingus is since he died. He used to be perceived as a virtuoso bass player, as a band leader, as a colorful character on stage, and he was all of these things, but people didn't play Mingus like they played Duke Ellington or Thelonious Monk. He was not perceived as a composer. He knew he was first and foremost a composer.
That's what I thought yesterday. When I was in Berlin and saw the Rias Big Band perform his music, I thought he would have loved it, because that's right that he saw himself as a composer, of course. And
he knew who he was as a composer, but it took the world a while to catch up to this. And he was such a dominant force. I think he monopolized his music, and other people didn't want to trespass the turf, belong to Mingus. Now people play Mingus all the time, students, schools, other musicians. But this is different, very different from in Charles' day.
Were you ever present when he had to fight with racism in the US? Or
fight?
A fight with racism in the US? Maybe, I think in New York it was not so bad, right?
No, I don't understand. Fighting? You're talking about fist fight?
No, when when racism actually happened to
racism. Yeah, I mean, a cab might not pick you up after a standing ovation at Carnegie Hall. Charles could go out on 57th Street and not be able to stop a cab. It was from one extreme of appreciation to the other of being a black man on the street. But I never paid attention to this. So, Charles was already prepared like a battleship, to fire cannons. But, it didn't touch me. I didn't grow up with racism or intolerance, so it kind of rubbed off my skin. And again, we were in New York, we weren't in the South. So a white woman and a black man, ho-hum, in New York.
But was it something you would say through the relationship with Charles, you learned about some new things about racism in the US? Or would you say it was obvious?
No, I certainly learned a lot. I grew up in the Middle West. Racism was not apparent. I didn't witness it. There weren't black kids in my school. My parents were not intolerant, but it wasn't an issue. You know, when I came to New York, of course, it was the 60s. There were the civil rights movement and marches and so forth. And
a few months before his death, I think, Joni Mitchell came along and wanted to do a record with him. Do you remember how that happened?
There was an Italian filmmaker who wanted to find a project for Charles to do. He was becoming paralyzed, and he was a friend of ours. And ultimately, when Charles could no longer compose at the piano, he was spent his days at the piano composing. But when he could no longer do that, when he was becoming paralyzed, he used what was left, his voice. And he sang compositions straight through into a tape recorder. So Joni Mitchell took 5 or 6 or 7 of those, Charles's frail voice, da 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 da. That's a piece called Chair in the. She wrote a piece called Chair in the Sky because we lived on the 43rd floor of an apartment, and he was in a wheelchair. And when she met him, he was in a chair in the sky. It's a beautiful, beautiful ballad, and she wrote lovely lyrics to it.
Did he know who she was, and was he interested in what she was doing? Or?
When she walked into her apartment, he looked at her and he said, "You're the hillbilly singer." So she kind of drew herself up, and then she burst out laughing, and they liked each other from the start. She realized he was being a little, you know, teasing her.
Yeah, I'm sure she's not shy, right?
No, he didn't know her music, but this friend of ours had this. Actually, the friend wanted Joni to take the 4 quartets of T.S. Eliot and paraphrase them and have Charles write music for them. And Joni said she'd rather paraphrase the Bible than paraphrase T.S. Eliot. So then it went a different direction, the project.
So when he died, when did you realize that it was something of a task for you to keep his heritage alive?
When did I realize?
When did you realize that it was a task for you to keep his music alive? Because you did a lot.
I never thought of it as a visionary thing. It was one foot following the other. I picked up the phone one day, someone by mistake had called me. They were producing 4 concerts in Philadelphia at the Walnut Theater, one of the oldest, and they decided to do a jazz series. And I said, I'll do it. And so I booked, I think first there was a Mingus tribute at Carnegie Hall, and they asked me to put together a band, something I'd never done. And Sonny Rollins played, I think Lionel Hampton played, Alvin Ailey, a dancer, had one of his dancers perform a piece Mingus wrote. And then we had this brand new band called the Mingus Dynasty. And the curious thing, the revelation was that nobody else played Mingus, you see. And this little band I had put together played all Mingus. So that was the beginning. And then a big entrepreneur, George Wein, booked the band that summer at festivals, and it took off.
Was it easy for you putting bands together, booking studios or festivals? Or
no, I learned a lot of bitter lessons. I mean, you know, it's like birds attack the vulnerable. You know, when musicians know if you show any sign of weakness, I mean, they will attack. So I had a lot of lessons to learn, and it was quite a challenging experience.
Did you have a personal relationship to most of his musicians?
Not really. In the beginning, in order to have an authentic Mingus band, everyone had to have performed with Mingus. This was a sine qua non of the band in the beginning. Now, no one's in this band, no one performed. They were all in diapers when Charles died, or I mean, they were, you know, very young. But when the Mingus dynasty began in 1979, it's a long time ago, 28 years ago, 29 years ago. Everyone in the band except the bass player had played with Mingus. John Handy, Roland Hanna, Jimmy Nipper, Danny Richmond, Charles McPherson. I mean, there were many, you know, and then gradually we created a pool of musicians, not by design, but because these were all musicians who had their own bands, and they were very busy. They did recording dates, they traveled to Japan, they traveled to Europe. So we had to keep finding someone else to play trumpet or someone else to play trombone. And gradually I developed a pool of over 100 musicians who have learned this so-called, in the beginning, difficult music. Charles's music had the reputation of being inaccessible, difficult, and it's proven to be not true at all.
So
It's your ears have to grow up to a new, it's very unique, original music, and you know, it took a while.
yeah, I think a musician, for instance, like Danny Richmond was very crucial for the music of Charles Mingus, I think. So, did they like what you did?
Well, I'd be crazy if I didn't.
No, I mean,
No,
the
it was,
musicians
no,
did.
I have to say, the music is always challenging, and it's so enormously varied and so utterly personal. It's astonishing music. And I've gone to hear, after Charles died, people invited me to go hear the music, and I very quickly became bored. I have to say, Charles's music is, for me, and for all these musicians, it's very easy to find musicians to play Mingus music because it's challenging. It requires them to bring their own personality to the music. You have to be many things to play Mingus music. You have to read like a classical musician. You have to be able to read. There's a lot of complex music. You have to improvise like a jazz musician. You have to have a voice of your own, a personality. Charles always said, play yourself, be yourself. And you're exposed when you play Mingus music. There are a lot of moments when you're out there and you better have something to say. And then you have to play in the ensemble. So it's very demanding. And for the right musician, they take to it like a duck to water. I mean, it's fun. The music has wit and humor, and it has all the passions in the spectrum. You know, there are blues, there are difficult European classical forms, there are through composed pieces, there are lush ballads, Latin music, sambas, mambos, Dixieland. I mean, Charles really took all these different musics and turned them into Mingus music.
Did the musicians appreciate that you did what you did?
I doubt it.
So nowadays, of course,
It was a gig that paid money, you know.
nowadays,
Good music.
Of course, there are not so many musicians alive who ever played with him. So
Not so many. Charles McPherson, but he doesn't play with us, but he's alive. Ted Curson doesn't play with us. He played for a minute with Charles. John Stubblefield played 3 months with Charles. He died. Danny Richmond, I mean, most of the musicians have died. Ronnie Cuber recorded, and Randy Brecker recorded with Charles.
So you have to pick new ones, of course. What are you looking for when you do that?
Well, you know, word travels like a brush fire in the musical community, and anywhere else for that matter. If somebody new is on the block who's good, you find out about it. Either they come, we have a gig every Tuesday night in Manhattan, so there's ample opportunity for musicians to come and sit in, and then if we like them, the next time there's an open, you know, that's usually how it works. Or I hear about somebody that's good.
I I especially, for instance, think about Wayne Escoffery, who I met just outside. And I knew him before, but I didn't know that he played in the Mingus Dynasty, and I think he's
wonderful.
He fits very well.
Mark Gross is a relative newcomer to us. He's been playing with Dave Holland, but they're all marvelous. The trombone player was a student of Conrad Herwig, who's been playing in all. We have 3 bands that play all the time. We alternate them, depending on circumstances.
Yeah, I just wanted to say the Mingus Dynasty, of course, is not the only band which plays in.
No, we have the Mingus Big Band, which has become maybe the best known. It started with the Mingus Dynasty, and then we doubled it. Went from 7 to 14 musicians. After hearing Epitaph, Charles's almost 3-hour work for 30 musicians, which was never played in his lifetime. The complete performance. He was very prescient, he was very prophetic. He called it Epitaph. He said he wrote it for his tombstone. And in fact, it was performed 10 years after his death. And hearing this sweeping music with all the harmonies and the complexities made me want to enlarge the smaller band. So that was the genesis of the Mingus Big Band.
And which is the third band?
The third is called the Mingus Orchestra. And believe me, I have had no desire to start these bands, but one thing has led to another. The owner of the club where the Mingus Big Band played was opening another club in New York, and he said, "Can you give me another Mingus band?" Because we were doing very well. And I said, "Isn't that cutting the baby in half? You know, we're doing well there, why start another?" And he said, no, every neighborhood is different, you know. So I thought, well, why do the same thing? And I got a bunch of arrangers and conductors together to figure out a different lineup, a different group of instruments. And we came up with French horn, which Charles loved. There used to be someone called Julius Watkins, marvelous French horn player. We had a bassoon, a bass clarinet, instruments that are a bit exotic for jazz. They're not normally used. And a guitar, which wasn't in the other bands. For a while we had a cello. It went through some sea changes, but right now it's, we had a piano, but the piano player didn't show up one night and we thought it sounded great without the piano. So we turned the piano part over to the guitar. So this is how it happens, you know, it's serendipitous.
So it sounds like a terrible lot of work.
No, one foot follows the other foot. It really isn't.
So you take it easy.
It's jazz. It's a lot of just improvising, and something happens accidentally, and we say, hey, that's a good idea. Let's go that way.
When tapes are found which with Mingus music never released before, I think you are involved in that too, is that right? There was this live at the UCLA last year, I think. You had something
Well, you know, that had never been out on CD. Charles and I, as I mentioned, when I first met him, we had a little mail order record company, and we released 4 albums. And one of them was typical Mingus title, music written for Monterey, not played, performed at UCLA. And that had never come out on CD, so I released that last year. But this, we released something a month ago that has never been out, an astonishing concert from 1964 with Eric Dolphy and the great Johnny Coles. Dexter Gordon used to call him the Holy Man. Johnny Coles, Clifford Jordan, and then the rhythm section with Jackie Byard, Danny Richmond, and Charles. And they're all young and strong and beautiful and just playing so gloriously. And a DVD has just come out also.